How do you kill a king twice? The first death takes his breath. The second, and perhaps the more cruel death, takes his name. It chisels his legacy from the stone walls, erases his existence from the memory of mankind, and leaves a scar in history, a silent void where a life once was. They wanted him to dissolve into the dust, to become a whisper that no one could remember, and for over 3,000 years, they succeeded. The irony is that the victim of ancient Egypt's most brutal act of historical erasure is now the most famous pharaoh who ever lived. His name, once forbidden and removed, now echoes in museums across the globe, conjuring images of solid gold, unimaginable treasures, and a deadly curse. His name is Tutankhamun. This is not the story of his greatness in life, but the story of his greatness in death. This is the tale of how a forgotten king became immortal, not because of the temples he built, but because of the tomb they tried so hard to hide. To understand this erasure, we must look to his father, the pharaoh Akhenaten, a heretic who turned Egypt on its head. Akhenaten dismantled the old gods, worshipping only the sun disk, Aten, and invoking the wrath of the powerful priesthood. Tutankhamun inherited this chaos, and his reign was a desperate attempt to heal the wounds, to return Egypt to its traditional ways. But it wasn't enough. For the pharaohs who followed, like the general Horemheb, that entire era was a shameful chapter that needed to be ripped out of the history books. They erased not only Akhenaten, but the son who tried to fix his mistakes. Tutankhamun's name was struck from the king lists, his statues usurped, he was officially made a ghost, and that invisibility is precisely what saved him. Because he was deemed unimportant, so was his tomb, a small, humble chamber in the Valley of the Kings. So small, in fact, that the workers building the tomb for the later Ramesses VI built their huts directly on top of it, unwittingly shielding the entrance. The rock and debris from that construction became the perfect shield, sealing him away from tomb robbers and from the currents of history for 3,200 years. The desert finished the job the pharaohs had started. The sands of time buried the name of Tutankhamun. He slept in darkness, a secret kept by silence, waiting for a single voice to call out to him across 3 millennia. Before there was a forgotten king, there was a king who tried to change the world. Before the darkness of a sealed tomb, there was the blinding light of a single God that burned tradition to the ground. To understand the short life and mysterious death of Tutankhamun, we cannot begin with the boy. We must begin with the father, who forged a legacy so tumultuous it fell upon the son to bear its weight. The pharaoh Akhenaten, Egypt's greatest heretic. Imagine Egypt before this earthquake. For more than 1,500 years, the land had lived and breathed to the rhythm of its gods. A vibrant and crowded pantheon presided over every aspect of existence. There was Ra, the supreme sun god, who sailed across the sky each day in his barque of millions of years. There was Osiris, king of the afterlife, who judged the souls of the dead. There was Isis, the faithful wife and powerful mother, and reigning above them all in Thebes, the seat of power, was Amun-Ra, the king of the gods. Amun-Ra was not just a deity, he was an empire. His priesthood at the Temple of Karnak controlled a third of Egypt's most fertile land. They were bankers, landlords, and political strategists. Their wealth, drawn from the spoils and tributes of pharaonic conquests, was all offered in thanks to Amun-Ra. Their power could rival, and at times eclipse, that of the pharaoh himself. For generations, this symbiotic relationship between the throne and the temple had defined Egypt's stability. Into this world of unshakable tradition and power, a prince named Amenhotep IV was born. At first, there was little to suggest he would be the one to shatter the mold. He was not the intended heir, his older brother was. But after his brother's early death, Amenhotep IV took the throne. For the first few years, he ruled as his fathers had, honoring the old gods and Amun-Ra in particular. But beneath the surface, an ideological revolution was brewing. In the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV did the unthinkable. He cast off his own name, a name that meant Amun is satisfied, and took a new title, Akhenaten. he who is effective for the Aten. With that, he declared that all the old gods were false. There was only one true, universal God, the Aten. The Aten was not a new god, but Akhenaten's conception of it was. The Aten had no human or animal form. It was the physical disk of the sun itself, an abstract, intangible source of life. The rays of the Aten did not just shine on Egypt, they reached all lands, all peoples. In a world of local and tribal deities, this was a profoundly radical idea, one God for everyone. Akhenaten wasn't just changing a religion, he was attempting to redefine the very nature of divinity. This revolution was not merely intellectual, it was a direct and brutal assault on the old order. Akhenaten ordered the temples to Amun-Ra and the other gods closed. He seized their vast assets, redirecting their immense wealth into his own treasury. Worst of all, he sent men throughout the kingdom to commit a terrible blasphemy, to chisel the name of Amun-Ra from thousands of monuments, temples, and tombs. He sought to erase the memory of his divine rival, the very same act his own son would later suffer. To escape the powerful shadow of Thebes and Amun's priesthood, Akhenaten took an even bolder step. He abandoned the thousand-year-old capital and built an entirely new utopian city in the middle of the desert. He called it Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten known today as Amarna. This was a city built from scratch, dedicated solely to the worship of his one god. Everything in the city, from its open-air temples, designed to receive the Aten's direct light, to its palaces and homes, was made to honor the sun disk. With the new city came a new art style. Amarna art broke completely with the rigid, idealized formalism of traditional Egyptian art. Instead of perfect, muscular pharaohs, we see Akhenaten depicted with strange features: a long face, full lips, wide hips, and a paunchy stomach. Historians still debate whether this was a realistic depiction of a genetic condition or a new theological symbolism, showing the pharaoh as both the father and mother of humanity. The art also showed unprecedented moments of intimacy, Akhenaten kissing a daughter, Queen Nefertiti sitting on his lap. It was a shocking realism. But while the royal family lived in their utopian city, the rest of Egypt was seemingly falling apart. By focusing entirely on his religious revolution, Akhenaten neglected the affairs of the empire. Vassal kings in Syria and Palestine sent desperate letters found as the Amarna tablets pleading for help against enemies, pleas that were seemingly ignored. The economy, which had relied heavily on the old temple system, was thrown into chaos. And for the common people, who prayed to familiar gods for harvests and childbirth, the abstract religion of the Aten was likely foreign and frightening. It was into the very heart of this radical vortex that a boy named Tutankhaten was born. He grew up in a world where the names of the old gods were forbidden, where only one god was acknowledged, and where his father was that God's sole prophet. He knew nothing of the world of Amun-Ra, Osiris, or Isis. His heritage was woven from the threads of heresy, and it was that heritage that would become both his crown and his curse. Akhenaten's revolution ultimately failed. Upon his death, it collapsed almost immediately, and the burden of cleaning up the rubble, of bringing Egypt back from the brink of chaos, would fall on the shoulders of a 9-year-old boy who would soon have to renounce his own name to appease the very gods his father tried to destroy. A name in ancient Egypt was more than a label. It was a declaration, a destiny, a sacred contract between a person and the divine. A pharaoh's name, above all, was a political platform and a sacred oath. It defined an entire reign. And for the young boy sitting on the most powerful throne in the world, the name he carried was a death sentence for his father's legacy. His name was Tutankhaten, the living image of the Aten. It was a heretic's name, a daily reminder of a failed revolution, of abandoned gods, and of a nation on the verge of collapse. That boy, a mere 9 years old, was the last male of a turbulent royal line. Imagine the weight on those small shoulders. He sat on the lion throne, his feet likely dangling far from the floor, lost in the grand halls of the Amarna palace, the utopian city his father had built. That city was no longer a symbol of enlightenment, but a testament to hubris and failure. Surrounding him were not childhood friends, but seasoned politicians and battle-hardened generals with calculating eyes. Chief among them were the vizier a wise but cunning old statesman, and General Horemheb, an ambitious soldier who saw opportunity in the chaos. They were the true power. To these men, and to the resurgent priesthood of Amun-Ra in Thebes, the name Tutankhaten was an intolerable insult. It was an open wound, for Egypt to be healed, for the gods to be appeased, for order to be restored. That name had to die, and with it, the entire legacy of Akhenaten had to be buried. The pressure on the young king would have been immense. He had no allies, no army of his own, and the memory of his heretical father was a liability, not a strength. His choice was stark: cling to his father's legacy and go down with it, or renounce it to save the kingdom and likely his own life. The decision was made, not in a fiery battle, but in calculated, shadowy councils. The first, most symbolic step was a great exodus. The royal court had to leave Akhetaten. Picture the scene: a long procession of officials, soldiers, and servants, packing up the remnants of a broken dream. They loaded chests of gold and finery onto carts, leaving the open-air temples and sprawling palaces to the desert wind and sand. The departure from Amarna was not just a geographical move, it was a proclamation that Akhenaten's experiment was over. The city of the Aten was left to decay, to become a ghost city, a warning to any who would dare challenge the old gods again. The journey back to the old centers of power, Memphis and Thebes, was a journey back to the past, and once the court was re-established, the most important act took place. In a solemn ceremony, or perhaps simply by royal decree, the boy Tutankhaten shed a piece of his identity. The Aten was excised. In its place was inserted the name of the very god his father had tried to destroy, Amun. He became Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. His wife, Ankhesenpaten, had to do the same, becoming Ankhesenamun. It was the final surrender. It was the admission that the revolution was dead. But a name change was not enough. It had to be backed by deeds to prove this new loyalty. Shortly thereafter, one of the most important documents of the reign was issued, the Restoration Stele. This stone tablet was a public confession and a promise. It described the dilapidated state of Egypt under Akhenaten in brutally frank terms. When His Majesty appeared as king, the temples of the gods and goddesses had fallen into ruin. Their shrines were desolate, having become overgrown mounds. The gods had turned their backs upon this land. Having painted this bleak picture, the stele then lists Tutankhamun's restorative acts. He had spent the day and night thinking up plans. He had the temples rebuilt, commissioned new statues of the gods from gold and precious stones, and doubled, tripled, and quadrupled their offerings. He recruited new priests and priestesses from the children of the nobility. He essentially opened the royal treasury and handed wealth and power back to the very priesthood his father had tried to dismantle. It was a complete policy reversal. The change worked. Order was restored. The priests were satisfied. The military was stable, and the people could go back to worshipping their familiar deities. By renouncing his father, Tutankhamun saved Egypt from a potential civil war. He acted as a true statesman, placing the stability of his nation above personal loyalty. But we must ask, was this truly the decision of a 9-year-old boy, or was he merely the mouthpiece for the ambitions of Ai and Horemheb? In all likelihood, he was an intelligent pawn in a complex game, the necessary royal face to legitimize the return to the old order. By putting his name to the Restoration Stele and changing his own name, he performed the most significant political act of his life. But ironically, this act of healing the kingdom was also the first step in the erasure of his family's legacy. By helping to bury the memory of his father, he unwittingly laid the groundwork for his own name to one day be chiseled from history. The name was changed, the gods were appeased, the temples were reopened, their coffers overflowing with royal gold. From the outside, the chaos of the Amarna heresy was over, and the divine order, the sacred concept of Ma'at, had been restored to Egypt. At the center of this restored universe sat the young king, Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun, the lord of the two lands. He was draped in the finest linens, adorned with gold and lapis lazuli, and worshipped as a living god. He had everything a mortal could ever dream of, Akhenaten, that is, except for power. His reign was not a rule, it was a performance. He was the star of a magnificent, kingdom-wide spectacle, living his life inside a gilded cage, while his father, obsessive revolutionary, had been an active. Tutankhamun's life was likely one of passive ceremony. His days were dictated not by matters of state, but by the sacred rituals his position demanded. The awakening of a pharaoh was a religious event, his morning ablutions, a purification ritual, the act of dressing him a sacred robing ceremony conducted by priests. His meals were offerings. His public appearances were the moments a god graced the mortal plane. His primary function was not to command armies or draft laws, but to exist as the perfect, the holy intermediary between the gods and the people of Egypt. It was his presence, not his policies, that kept the Nile flooding and the harvests plentiful. The real work of running an empire fell to the two men who had engineered his return to tradition, the wise old Vizier I and the formidable General Horemheb. They were the hands, the mind, and the sword of the kingdom, while Tutankhamun was its divine heart. Imagine the secret councils held in the chambers of the palace at Memphis. Horemheb, the pragmatist soldier, would unroll maps detailing insurrection in Nubia or the Hittite threat on the Syrian border. He would speak of supply lines, troop movements, and military strategy. The master bureaucrat, who had served for decades, would manage the vast logistics of the state, the grain stores, the tax collection, the diplomatic correspondence with foreign kings. And where was Tutankhamun in these meetings? He was almost certainly present. As the god king, his approval was the final, necessary stamp on any decision. But it is difficult to imagine a teenager, even a bright one, truly directing the policy of these two vastly more experienced men. It is more likely he listened, learned, and ultimately acquiesced. His was the voice that gave the commands, but the words themselves were likely crafted by his advisors. They had saved his kingdom, and in doing so, they had taken control of it. Their loyalty was to the stability of Egypt, and the boy on the throne was the most important tool they had to maintain it. This is not to say his life was empty. The thousands of objects buried with him paint a picture of a young man with passions and pursuits beyond the temple. The tomb was a garage of pharaonic supercars, containing 6 priceless, expertly crafted chariots. Some were light, nimble vehicles, built for speed, likely for hunting in the desert. Others were heavier, armored war chariots meant for battle. His name was found inscribed on a building at Karnak that read, "The one who spends his entire time making chariots of electrum and copper, to the joy of his father Amun." He was also buried with a vast arsenal of bows, arrows, and shields. While many of the depictions of him smiting Egypt's enemies are standard royal propaganda, the sheer volume of high-quality sporting and military equipment suggests a genuine passion. Perhaps galloping across the desert sands, bow in hand, it was the only place the king could truly feel free and in command. We also see glimpses of the person behind the golden mask. The tomb contained a beautifully painted chest depicting intimate scenes of the king and his queen, Ankhesenamun. She anoints him with perfume, accompanies him on the hunt, and presents him with flowers. Having grown up together in the strange, isolated world of Amarna, their bond was likely one of genuine affection amidst the immense pressures of their royal duty. More poignantly, the tomb contained a small, undecorated wooden box. Inside, nestled in a series of miniature coffins, was a lock of hair belonging to his grandmother, Queen Tiye. It is a profoundly human artifact, a treasured memento kept by a young man of the powerful matriarch who had overseen the empire before the chaos began. But this human story is also a dynastic tragedy. For a pharaoh, the single most important duty was to produce a male heir to ensure the continuation of the royal line and the stability of Egypt. This was the one duty Tutankhamun could not fulfill. The most heartbreaking discovery within his tomb was that of two small, mummified fetuses, buried with him for eternity. DNA analysis has confirmed these were his daughters, one who died at around 5 to 6 months of gestation, the other at or near full term. We can only imagine the personal grief he and Ankhesenamun must have felt, but this was also a catastrophic political failure. Without an heir, the future was dangerously uncertain. With every passing year that Tutankhamun failed to produce a son, his own position became more precarious. The shadows of Ai and Horemheb grew longer. They were the ones keeping the empire strong, while the king himself could not secure its future. The gilded cage, for all its splendor, was becoming a trap. The young king was performing his role perfectly, but he was failing at the one task that could guarantee his own survival and that of his dynasty. Time was running out. Every king casts a shadow. It is a law of nature, a consequence of power and light. But in the court of Tutankhamun, the shadows behind the throne were darker, deeper, and held more substance than the boy king himself. As his reign progressed and the royal nursery remained tragically empty, it became terrifyingly clear that the future of Egypt did not rest with the young pharaoh. It rested with his two guardians, his masters, his potential successors. They were Vizier Ai and General Horemheb. They were allies of convenience, united in their mission to stabilize Egypt. But they were also rivals in a silent, high-stakes game where the ultimate prize was the throne itself. With every beat of the king's fragile heart, their own ambitions grew stronger. To understand them is to understand the forces that truly shaped this era. They were not simple villains. They were complex, brilliant men who had weathered the storm of Akhenaten's heresy and emerged more powerful than ever. First, there was the fox. He was the ultimate court insider, a man whose life was intricately woven into the fabric of the 18th dynasty. Many historians believe he was the brother of Queen Tiye, the great and formidable wife of Amenhotep III, which would make him Akhenaten's uncle and Tutankhamun's great-uncle. He was not just an advisor, he was family. This gave him a unique intimacy and influence. Ai was a master survivor. He had served with distinction under Akhenaten, holding the highest titles in the heretic's court. Yet he seamlessly orchestrated the return to the old gods under Tutankhamun. This was not a man of rigid ideology, but of supreme political pragmatism. His power did not come from the sword, but from the scroll. He was the head of the civil administration, the keeper of the nation's laws, the master of diplomacy. His influence was felt in every decree signed, every tax collected, every treaty negotiated. His approach was one of subtlety and patience. He likely played the part of the wise, grandfatherly mentor to Tutankhamun, guiding his hand, whispering advice, all while carefully positioning himself as the logical, legitimate heir should the dynasty fail. He represented the continuity of the state, the power of the bureaucracy. Then there was Horemheb, the wolf. Where Ai was a product of the palace, Horemheb was a product of the barracks. He was a commoner by birth, a man who had risen through the ranks of the Egyptian army on sheer talent, bravery, and ambition. He was the nation's foremost general, the de facto commander-in-chief, and the soldiers adored him. His power was not based on bloodlines or courtly intrigue, but on the loyalty of tens of thousands of armed men. Horemheb likely viewed the Amarna period with pure disgust. To a military man dedicated to the glory and expansion of the empire, Akhenaten's introspective, pacifist reign was a period of national shame and weakness. His primary goal was the restoration of Egypt's imperial might. During Tutankhamun's reign, it was Horemheb who led the armies into Nubia and Syria. reclaiming lost territories and reasserting Egyptian dominance. These victories were celebrated in the young king's name, but everyone in the court knew who had truly earned them. Horemheb was the hard power to A's soft power. He was direct, disciplined, and likely impatient with the slow pace of politics. He represented the power of the military, the promise of a firm hand to guide Egypt back to glory. These two men formed an uneasy alliance. They needed each other. I needed Horemheb's army to enforce the return to order and to quell any lingering dissent from Aten worshippers. Horemheb needed A's administrative genius and political legitimacy to manage the country while he was on campaign. And they both needed Tutankhamun. The boy king was the sacred vessel that made their power legitimate. Without him, they were just two ambitious men. With him, they were the loyal servants of a living god. But beneath this cooperative surface, the tension must have been immense. Every decision was a potential chess move. When Horemheb requested funds for a new military campaign, was it purely for the good of Egypt, or also to increase his own prestige and the army's loyalty to him? When I appointed a new priest at the temple of Karnak, was it for religious piety, or to place a key ally in a position of influence? They were in a silent, deadly race against time. Tutankhamun was trapped between them. Did he see the game being played around him? As a teenager, he must have grown more aware of the dynamics at court. Perhaps he tried to carve out his own sphere of influence, focusing on the religious and ceremonial duties that were unquestionably his. The vast restoration project, the commissioning of new statues and festival celebrations, these were areas where he, as the pharaoh, could exert his will. It is possible he attempted to play his two powerful advisors off one another, a dangerous game for a king with no heir and no independent power base, or perhaps he simply trusted them, viewing I as the wise grandfather and Horemheb as the nation's heroic protector. The truth, like so much of his life, is lost to the silence of the tomb. What is certain is that as the years passed, the ground shifted beneath the throne. With no son to succeed him, Tutankhamun's value as a long-term solution diminished. He was becoming a placeholder. The alliance of convenience between the fox and the wolf began to fray. They were no longer just managing the present. They were positioning themselves for the future. The question hanging in the air of the palace was no longer, how can we best serve the king? But what happens when the king is gone? The shadows were no longer just advising the throne. They were beginning to covet it. The gilded cage suddenly swung open, but not into freedom. Its occupant, the divine heart of Egypt, simply stopped beating. In the 10th year of his reign, at the approximate age of 19, King Tutankhamun was dead. The news must have ripped through the palace at Memphis and echoed down the halls of the temples at Thebes like a phantom shockwave. The living god was gone. The last male heir of the glorious 18th dynasty was no more. For a nation built on the promise of divine continuity, this was the ultimate crisis. His death was not a quiet fading away. It was an abrupt, brutal end that left a power vacuum so vast it threatened to swallow the entire kingdom, and it sparked a question that would smolder for over 3,000 years. Was this a tragic accident, a swift and deadly illness, or was it murder? For centuries, the truth was buried with him. But in 2005, a state-of-the-art CT scanner gave the boy king a virtual autopsy, and the secrets of his final days began to emerge. The most startling discovery was not in his skull, where a previous X-ray had misleadingly suggested a blow to the head, but in his legs. The scans revealed that just days before his death, Tutankhamun had suffered a horrific injury, a severe compound fracture to his left femur, just above the knee. This was not a simple break. The bone had shattered and pierced the skin, creating a massive, gruesome, open wound. In an age without antibiotics, without surgery, without even a basic understanding of infection, this was a catastrophic injury for anyone, let alone a pharaoh whose body was already weakened. This wound became the catalyst in a perfect storm of medical disasters. Later, DNA analysis in 2010 added another crucial piece to the puzzle. Scientists found genetic material from Plasmodium falciparum, the parasite that causes the most virulent form of malaria. Tutankhamun had suffered from chronic malaria, likely for years. The final, fatal sequence of events now seems tragically clear. Perhaps while hunting, his favorite pastime, his chariot overturned, or perhaps due to his congenital clubfoot, he simply fell. He sustained the terrible fracture. The open wound, contaminated by dirt and debris, quickly became infected. His immune system, already compromised and weakened by genetic defects resulting from generations of inbreeding, was thrown into chaos. The shock and trauma of the injury likely triggered a sudden, severe flare-up of his latent malaria. Within days, the king would have been consumed by a raging fever, his body fighting a losing battle against both blood poisoning from the wound and a deadly parasitic infection. His death was likely agonizing, swift, and inevitable. Science suggests it was a tragic accident, but history suggests something more complicated. While his body was failing, a political crisis of epic proportions was exploding. Tutankhamun had died with no son. His wife, Ankhesenamun, now a teenage widow, was the last pure royal blood of the dynasty. According to tradition, she would be expected to marry a high-ranking Egyptian, a servant, as she might see it, to legitimize his claim to the throne. The most obvious candidate was the aged Vizier I, but Ankhesenamun, in an act of breathtaking desperation, refused to be a pawn in their game. Her next move is one of the most astonishing episodes in the history of international diplomacy, discovered thousands of years later, not in Egypt, but in the clay tablet archives of the Hittite Empire, Egypt's greatest rival. In a letter to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma, then a queen of Egypt, almost certainly, Ankhesenamun wrote a plea that still echoes with fear and defiance. "My husband has died. I have no son. They say you have many sons. If you would give me one of your sons, he would become my husband. I would never take a servant of mine and make him my husband. I am afraid." This letter was an earth-shattering breach of protocol. An Egyptian queen from a nation that viewed itself as the superior center of the world, begging her sworn enemy for a prince to marry, is an act of sheer desperation. It speaks volumes about the situation in the Egyptian court. Who was this servant she so vehemently refused to marry? Who was she so afraid of? While we cannot know for sure, all evidence points to i.e., the man next in line, the man who stood to gain the most from the king's death. Her letter is a smoking gun, suggesting she felt trapped, coerced, and was willing to risk war with a foreign power to escape her fate. The Hittite king was understandably suspicious, thinking it was a trap, but after confirming the story, he agreed to this unprecedented alliance and dispatched one of his sons, Prince Zananza, to Egypt to marry the queen and become pharaoh. The plan, however, was doomed. The Hittite archives record the tragic outcome. Prince Zananza and his entourage were assassinated as they crossed the border into Egyptian territory. He never reached his bride. An accident, highly unlikely. The murder of a foreign prince on a diplomatic mission is an act of war. It could only have been ordered by someone with supreme authority over the Egyptian military at the borders, someone who had everything to lose from a foreign prince taking the throne. The list of suspects is brutally short. It includes the two men who controlled Egypt, the two shadows behind the throne, General Horemheb, who would never accept a Hittite on the throne of the pharaohs, and Vizier A, whose own path to power would be blocked by the prince's arrival. The death of King Tutankhamun was no longer just a medical mystery, it was now the epicenter of a dark and bloody conspiracy. A desperate queen's gambit had failed, a foreign prince lay dead, and the throne of Egypt was now truly empty, waiting to be claimed by whoever was ruthless enough to seize it. For an ancient Egyptian, death was not an end. It was merely a doorway, a transition to an eternal life that mirrored the best of one's time on earth. For a pharaoh, this transition was the single most important event of his existence, a sacred process planned from the moment he took the throne. The mummification, the elaborate rituals, the multi-chambered tomb filled with treasures, all were designed to ensure his successful rebirth as a god. A royal funeral was a meticulously choreographed, sacred affair that traditionally took a minimum of 70 days. It was a national event, a slow, deliberate, and holy process. King Tutankhamun was afforded no such dignity. The evidence, written in stone, plaster, and gold, screams one undeniable fact. His funeral was a frantic, rushed affair. The boy king, who had been thrust onto the throne in a crisis, was now being thrust into the afterlife with equal haste. The chaos that defined his life would also define his death. This raises the next great question in the conspiracy. Why the hurry to bury a god? The answer, like the tomb itself, lies hidden beneath the surface, revealing a story of pure political calculation. The first and most glaring piece of evidence is the tomb itself, his eternal home. Designated KV 62 inch, the Valley of the Kings, is an insult to a pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. It is minuscule compared to the sprawling, multi-level necropolises of other kings like Seti I, with their long corridors, descending staircases, and numerous chambers decorated with the entire Book of the Dead. Tutankhamun's tomb is little more than a cramped basement apartment. It consists of just 4 small, undecorated rooms, barely enough space to contain the treasures required for a pharaoh's afterlife. Archaeologists are almost certain that this was not originally intended to be his tomb. It was likely a private tomb commissioned for a high-ranking noble, perhaps even for A himself, that was hastily repurposed upon the king's unexpected death. His own grander, royal tomb was almost certainly under construction elsewhere, but it was nowhere near ready, and the new power in Egypt could not wait. The second clue is painted on the walls of the burial chamber itself. While the scenes depicting his journey into the underworld are beautiful, they are unique in the Valley of the Kings for their hasty execution. They are painted in a style more akin to a private tomb than a royal one, but the most damning evidence is microscopic. Scientists studying the famous dark spots that dot the painted walls discovered that they were colonies of long-dead microorganisms. This could only have happened if the tomb was sealed while the plaster on the walls was still damp. There was no time for the paint to dry, no time for the plaster to properly cure. The team of artisans was literally painting against the clock. The moment they finished, the entrance was sealed, trapping the moisture inside and creating the perfect environment for microbes to grow. It is a forensic clue that proves the burial was completed in a desperate rush. The third indicator of haste is the treasure itself. While breathtaking in its completeness, a closer look reveals that much of it was second-hand. It seems the burial team, lacking the years necessary to create a full set of bespoke funerary items, frantically gathered whatever they could find. Many items, including the famous golden canopic coffinettes that held his internal organs, appear to have been originally crafted for someone else. The facial features on some pieces do not match Tutankhamun's other likenesses, and experts have found evidence of inscriptions being erased and recarved with his name. It suggests a desperate scramble through palace and temple storerooms, pulling items intended for other members of the royal family, perhaps even from Akhenaten's court, to quickly assemble a pharaonic burial package. Finally, there is the sheer chaos of the tomb's layout. The iconic photographs taken by Harry Burton at the time of the discovery show not a neatly arranged, sacred space, but what looks like a hoarder's storeroom. Golden chariots were disassembled and stacked against walls. Ornate couches were piled on top of each other. Boxes and chests were crammed into every available space with little regard for order. It was a clear sign that the workers' primary goal was not ritual propriety, but speed. They had to get everything inside so the door could be sealed. Why this frantic rush? The motive is purely political and leads directly back to the power vacuum created by his death. In ancient Egypt, the new pharaoh could only truly begin his reign and be seen as legitimate once the old king was interred. His journey to the afterlife officially underway. Every day that Tutankhamun remained unburied was a day of profound instability. A day the throne was technically empty, a day that a rival claim could emerge for Vizier A, who outmaneuvered everyone to become the next pharaoh. Finalizing the burial was his number one priority. It legitimized his succession and slammed the door on a dangerous chapter of Egyptian history. The rushed funeral was the final, calculated indignity. It was an act of political expediency disguised as religious duty. Sealing the tomb was not just about ensuring Tutankhamun's eternal life, but about securing A's mortal grasp on power. They buried the boy king and his secrets as quickly as they could, but in their haste, they created the very conditions for his ultimate revenge. The small, insignificant tomb, so easily overlooked, so quickly hidden by the debris of later constructions, would be the one that survived the ages, preserving its treasure and its dark story for a future world to uncover. I would never take a servant of mine and make him my husband. I am afraid. This was the desperate, terrified plea of Queen Ankhesenamun, scrawled in a secret letter to a foreign king. It was the last act of a cornered queen, a final attempt to retain some control over her own destiny and the fate of her nation. Her gambit failed. The Hittite prince who was to be her savior was murdered, and now her greatest fear was about to become her reality. The throne of the pharaohs, left vacant by her husband's sudden death, would not remain empty for long. The servant she so dreaded was about to become her master, her husband, and her king. The successor to the divine Tutankhamun was not a long-lost cousin with royal blood, nor a heroic young warrior. It was the aged, cunning Vizier A. His ascension was a masterstroke of political maneuvering, a swift and ruthless seizure of power that demonstrated a lifetime of experience in the treacherous corridors of the royal court. His first and most crucial move was to nullify the queen's final power play, her own hand in marriage. As the last surviving royal of the direct Amarna line, marrying Ankhesenamun was the clearest path to the throne. It was an act that was both a political necessity and a personal betrayal. We can only imagine the horror for the young widow, likely still in her early 20s, being forced to marry the old man who was her great-uncle and the prime suspect in the conspiracy that may have led to her husband's death. It was a deeply uncomfortable union that secured the transfer of power, but a marriage alone was not enough. A needed to publicly cement his role as the legitimate heir. He did this in the most audacious way imaginable, by leaving a piece of propaganda right at the scene of the crime, inside Tutankhamun's own tomb. On the north wall of the burial chamber, there is a vivid painting. It depicts a figure, already wearing the blue Kepresh crown of a reigning pharaoh, performing the sacred opening of the mouth ceremony on the mummy of Tutankhamun. This crucial ritual, which magically restored the senses of the deceased for the afterlife, was traditionally performed by the dead king's eldest son and heir. The figure in the painting, the one claiming the role of Tutankhamun's chosen successor, is unequivocally labeled with the name of A. It was a brilliant and shameless declaration. To anyone who entered that tomb in antiquity, the message was clear. I was not a usurper. He was the rightful inheritor of the throne, personally sanctioned by the departed king. But how did he neutralize the only other man in Egypt powerful enough to stop him? General Horemheb. A civil war between the head of the government and the head of the army would have torn the nation apart. The most logical explanation is that a deal was struck in the shadows. I was already an old man. Horemheb was younger, a patient and ambitious military hero. I likely offered the general a pact. Stand down, support my claim now, and I will officially designate you as my heir. You will have the throne upon my death, but through a peaceful, legitimate transition, not a bloody civil war. For Horemheb, the wolf, it was a logical choice. Why risk everything in a war when he could simply wait a few short years for the throne to be handed to him? And so, the army remained in its barracks, and Horemheb stood by as the old fox claimed his prize. A's reign was short, lasting only about 4 years. He worked quickly to solidify his legacy, continuing the restoration projects of Tutankhamun and further distancing his rule from the heresy of Akhenaten. He commissioned a grand tomb for himself in the Valley of the Kings WV-23 and a mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, all the essential building blocks for a pharaoh's eternal afterlife. He portrayed himself as a wise elder, a stabilizing force who had guided Egypt back from the brink. But his reign holds one final, dark mystery: the complete and utter disappearance of Queen Ankhesenamun. After the forced marriage that made A king, she vanishes from history. Her name is never mentioned again. No tomb has ever been definitively identified as hers. For the queen who had been depicted in so much loving detail at her first husband's side, this silence is deafening. Did she die of a broken heart or some sudden illness shortly after the marriage? Or, once she had served her purpose of legitimizing A's rule, was she quietly eliminated a loose end, a woman who knew too much and had already proven she was willing to defy him? Her vanishing acts as the final, tragic postscript to the story of the Amarna dynasty. I's seizure of power was a clinical success. He used tradition, propaganda, and shrewd deal-making to achieve a lifetime's ambition. He had outmaneuvered a desperate queen and neutralized a powerful general. But his reign was merely a brief interlude, a transitional chapter. He was an old man playing king, a placeholder between the end of one great dynasty and the beginning of another. His ascension marked the final death rattle of the royal bloodline of Thutmose I and Amenhotep III. The stage was now cleared, the path was set, and the wolf, Horemheb, long before the Romans had a name for it, damnatio memoriae, the pharaohs of Egypt had perfected the art. It is a punishment considered by many to be worse than death. To die is to leave the mortal world. To have your memory erased is to be denied existence in the next. It is to kill a soul. After the brief, transitional reign of A, the throne passed to the man who had patiently waited for it. The man who believed Egypt needed not just a new king, but a purification. The general, Horemheb, finally became pharaoh, and his first great war was not against the Hittites, but against the dead. His mission was to find every trace of the Amarna heresy, from the great heretic Akhenaten to the boy king Tutankhamun and the opportunistic Ai, and wipe it from the face of the earth. Horemheb's ascension marked the true end of the 18th dynasty's royal bloodline and the beginning of a new era of military strength. He was a commoner who had become a god, and he needed to legitimize his rule by connecting himself not to his immediate, controversial predecessors, but to the golden age of the dynasty's past. To do this, he had to rewrite history. He issued what is now known as his Great Edict, a sweeping declaration that essentially rendered the reigns of Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and Ai null and void. In the official record, the 30-odd years of the Amarna period were to be erased. Horemheb's reign was declared to have begun immediately after the death of Amenhotep III, the last great, orthodox pharaoh. Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and Ai became historical ghosts. This was not just a legal declaration. It was a physical, systematic campaign of destruction across the entire empire. Horemheb dispatched teams of stonemasons with a chillingly simple task: destroy the memory of the heretic kings. They swarmed the great temples at Karnak and Luxor, scouring every wall, column, and statue. They found the cartouches of Tutankhamun and Ai and meticulously chiseled them out, leaving blank, scarred ovals in the stone. In many cases, they didn't even leave the space blank. Horemheb simply had his own name carved over the top, literally overwriting their history with his own. Statues commissioned by Tutankhamun were now statues of Horemheb. Temples restored by the boy king were now recorded as the works of the general. The most brutal destruction was reserved for Akhenaten's capital, Akhetaten Amarna. The city, already abandoned, was now declared a quarry. Horemheb's workers descended upon the city of the sun and tore it apart, block by block. The temples to the Aten, the palaces where Tutankhamun was born, all were dismantled. The unique, smaller stone blocks, known as talatat, that were used to build the city, were loaded onto barges and shipped to Thebes. There, they were unceremoniously used as cheap, hidden filler material for the foundations of Horemheb's new pylons at the Temple of Karnak. Akhenaten's utopian dream was literally being used as rubble to build the monuments of the man who despised him. Why such a thorough and vicious campaign? The motives were threefold. First, it was about political legitimacy. By erasing the four kings who came after Amenhotep III, Horemheb positioned himself as the direct, rightful successor to that glorious reign, completely bypassing the embarrassing religious revolution. Second, it was an act of religious piety. Horemheb was a devout follower of Amun-Ra. Cleansing the land of the Aten heresy was a sacred duty, meant to ensure the gods would forever favor Egypt and his own reign. He was not just restoring temples, but restoring cosmic balance. Finally, it was about personal ambition. As a commoner on the throne, Horemheb needed to establish his legacy as the founder of a powerful new age. He could not afford to be seen as the end of a failed dynasty. He had to be the beginning of a great one. This required a clean and violent break with the perceived weakness of the past. For 3,000 years, this act of historical vandalism was a stunning success. When later pharaohs like Seti I and Ramesses the Great commissioned new, official king lists, such as the one carved in the temple at Abydos, the record jumps directly from Amenhotep III to Horemheb. The Amarna kings are completely absent. They had ceased to exist. But here, in this act of total erasure, lies the story's greatest irony. By wiping Tutankhamun from the historical record, Horemheb inadvertently became his ultimate protector. Ancient tomb robbers were not fools. They often worked from temple lists and records to target the tombs of great kings. But because Tutankhamun's name was on no list, because he was officially a non-person, his small, insignificant tomb was never a target. It was forgotten. Horemheb's campaign of damnation had the unintended consequence of saving the boy, king's treasures, and his secrets for a future age that would learn to read the ghosts. He had killed the king for a second time with a chisel. But in doing so, he had granted him an immortality beyond his wildest dreams. 3,200 years. It is a gulf of time so vast as to be almost incomprehensible. Empires rose and were ground into dust. Languages were born, spoken, and fell silent. The great religion of Amun-Ra and Osiris became a collection of myths. The sacred hieroglyphs that told the stories of the gods became a silent, beautiful riddle. The world forgot Tutankhamun. History itself forgot him. His name, once wiped clean by Horemheb, remained a blank space. But by the dawn of the 20th century, a new kind of magic was sweeping the world, the science of archaeology, and a new breed of adventurer, armed not with swords but with trowels and brushes, had descended upon Egypt, determined to make the ancient land give up its last secrets. This was the golden age of Egyptology. The Rosetta Stone had been deciphered, and the silent language of the pharaohs now spoke again. Great discoveries were being made, thrilling a world hungry for romance and adventure. But in the most famous royal cemetery on earth, the Valley of the Kings, the gold rush was seemingly over. One by one, the tombs of the great pharaohs had been found, and one by one, they had been found plundered, emptied of their treasures by ancient robbers. By 1912, the American archaeologist Theodore Davis, after years of digging, famously declared, "I fear that the Valley of the Tombs is now exhausted." The consensus was clear. There was nothing left to find. One man refused to believe it. His name was Howard Carter. And if history has a protagonist for its second act, it is him. Carter was not like the other leading Egyptologists of his day. He was not a wealthy aristocrat or a university-educated academic. He was the son of a provincial artist, a man of humble origins who first came to Egypt as a teenager with a remarkable talent for drawing. His job was to meticulously copy the paintings in ancient tombs. This artistic training, this need to see and record every minute detail, gave him a unique perspective. He learned to read the subtle language of the landscape, to see clues where others saw only rubble. Carter was a complex character, stubborn, notoriously short-tempered, meticulous to a fault, and utterly 219, single-mindedly obsessed. He was a brilliant field archaeologist, but his difficult personality had left him an outcast from the official antiquities service. He was a man with a grand ambition in need of a patron. He found one in George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. Lord Carnarvon was Carter's opposite in almost every way. He was immensely wealthy, an aristocrat who lived in the magnificent Highclere Castle, famous today as the setting of Downton Abbey. He was a collector of racehorses and a pioneer of the automobile, a passion that led to a near-fatal accident. His doctors advised him to spend winters in a warm, dry climate to recover, and he chose Egypt. What began as a hobby to pass the time soon became a passion. He was an enthusiastic amateur archaeologist who had the one thing Carter desperately needed: the official government concession to dig in the Valley of the Kings. Their partnership was a perfect fusion of ambition and means. Carnarvon provided the money, the political connections, and the unshakable belief. Carter provided the unparalleled expertise, the on-the-ground grit, and the all-consuming obsession. Their goal was the ultimate prize in Egyptology, a goal everyone else had abandoned as a fool's errand: the discovery of a complete, intact royal tomb. But where to look in a valley that had been exhausted? Carter's conviction was not based on a hunch. It was based on years of painstaking research. He was like a detective, piecing together scattered clues. He had noted the discovery by Theodore Davis of several small, seemingly insignificant artifacts: a faience cup, a piece of gold foil, and most importantly, a pit containing linen wrappings, broken pottery, and floral collars. All these items bore the name of a little-known king, Tutankhamun. Davis dismissed them as unimportant, but Carter saw a pattern. He believed these were not just discarded items, they were the sacred remnants from the king's mummification and funerary feast. He meticulously plotted their find spots on a map of the valley. They all pointed to a small, triangular patch of ground on the valley floor, right at the base of the tomb of a much greater pharaoh, Ramesses VI. This patch of ground had been overlooked by everyone else for a simple reason. It was covered by the ruins of ancient workers' huts, built by the very men who had constructed Ramesses' tomb. No one had bothered to do the hard work of clearing them. Carter theorized that Tutankhamun's tomb must be underneath these huts. Its entrance, he reasoned, had been buried by the debris of a later construction, a theory that eerily mirrored the historical reality of what happened. In 1917, their great search began. For 5 long, brutal, and soul-crushingly fruitless seasons, they dug under the punishing Egyptian sun. Carter's team of workers moved thousands upon thousands of tons of rock and sand. They found nothing. The heat was relentless, the dust was suffocating, and the cost was astronomical. Lord Carnarvon's patience and his fortune were beginning to run out. The First World War brought the work to a halt, adding years of delay. By the summer of 1922, the dream was fading. Carnarvon had spent a fortune and had nothing to show for it. He summoned Carter to Highclere Castle to deliver the bad news. This was the end. He was giving up the concession. The search was over. The story of Tutankhamun was destined to remain a footnote. The library at Highclere Castle is a magnificent room, lined with thousands of leather-bound books that hold the accumulated knowledge of generations. But in the summer of 1922, it was not a place of discovery, but of defeat. 2 men stood there, the lush, green English parkland, visible through the grand windows, a world away from the sun-scorched Egyptian dream that was now turning to dust between them. Lord Carnarvon, the patron, finally spoke the words Howard Carter had dreaded for years. It was over. The expense was too great. The years of failure too many. He was withdrawing his funding and relinquishing the concession to dig in the Valley of the Kings. For any rational man, the argument was sound. Carnarvon had poured a fortune, the equivalent of millions of dollars today, into Carter's search, and the returns had been negligible. The world's leading experts had all agreed the valley was exhausted. To continue was to defy logic, to throw good money after bad. But Howard Carter was not an entirely rational man. He was a man possessed by an idea, a belief so total it bordered on obsession. In that grand library, Carter made his final, desperate plea. He was not a gifted orator, but he spoke with the raw passion of a true believer. He unrolled his maps again, pointing to the small, insignificant triangle of land covered by the rubble of workers' huts. He reiterated his theory, pieced together from a few scattered, dismissed clues. He argued that this was the one patch of ground no one had ever properly cleared, the one place a secret could still lie hidden. When Carnarvon's polite but firm refusal held, Carter played his final card, a move of such conviction it bordered on madness. He, a man of modest means, offered to fund the final season himself. He would pay for the workers, the equipment, everything, for one last chance to prove his theory right. This was the turning point. Lord Carnarvon was moved. He could not, in good conscience, to allow the man he had partnered with for so long to bankrupt himself. This act of pure, unshakable faith convinced him. He looked at Carter, a man willing to risk everything for a ghost of a chance, and he relented. He would fund one more season, not a penny more. One final roll of the dice. Carter was to return to Egypt in the autumn with a clear and stark ultimatum: find something significant this time, or the dream was dead forever. Carter's return to his small house on the edge of the Valley of the Kings in October 1922 felt different from all the years before. The mood was not one of buoyant optimism, but of quiet, grim determination. The weight of the final chance hung over him and his loyal team of Egyptian workers, many of whom had been with him for years. They knew this was the end of the line. The work began on the 1st of November. There was no more prospecting, no more debating. Carter directed his foreman, Ahmed Gerigar, to a single spot, the triangle of land at the base of the tomb of Ramesses VI, the very spot his theory depended on. The work was slow and arduous. First, the team had to methodically clear the stone foundations of the ancient workers' huts that had sat undisturbed for over 3,000 years. The first day passed, nothing. The second day, the third, still nothing but rock and sand. With each passing hour, the immense weight of 5 years of failure and the ticking clock of Carnarvon's ultimatum pressed down harder. Then came the morning of the fourth day, the 4th of November, Etenjobayashar. The work began as usual in the cool desert dawn. The workers cleared the last of the hut foundations. A young water boy, tasked with bringing water to the thirsty crew, that was setting down his jars when his foot stumbled on something hard beneath the sand. It wasn't a loose boulder. It felt flat, with a sharp edge. Curious, he scraped away the dirt. It was a step, cut into the solid bedrock. He shouted. The foreman rushed over, took one look, and immediately ordered the work to stop. He sent the boy running to Carter's house. Carter arrived minutes later, his heart pounding. There, in the precise spot his research had indicated, was the undeniable proof. It was a single, man-made step carved into the limestone floor of the valley. After years of moving thousands of tons of meaningless rubble, this was it. This was the anomaly. This was the beginning. With a surge of adrenaline, Carter directed a frantic, yet careful, excavation. The workers cleared the sand and debris away from the first step. In doing so, they revealed a second, and then a third, and a fourth. A staircase, a complete, sunken staircase, descending into the darkness beneath the valley floor. A staircase that had been hidden from the world since the time of the boy king himself. He stood at the top, looking down the 16 steps that had just emerged from the past. The years of doubt, the frustration, the near-total failure, it all vanished in that single moment. The final season had barely begun, and in a few short hours, everything had changed. His wild, obsessive, illogical belief had led him to this single point. He had been right. Below him, somewhere at the bottom of these steps, a doorway to history was waiting to be opened. To stand at the top of that staircase was to stand on the precipice of history itself. For Howard Carter, every one of those 16 steps descending into the bedrock was a vindication, but it was also a torment. The instinct of the treasure hunter screamed at him to race down, to tear open whatever lay at the bottom. But the discipline of the archaeologist, honed over 30 years in the field, demanded patience. Every layer of dirt, every fragment of rock that filled that staircase was a historical document that had to be read carefully before it was discarded. The descent was agonizingly slow. Basket by basket, his workers meticulously cleared the rubble. Each one was sifted, examined for any clue, and then, at the bottom of the stairs, it appeared, a wall of rough stones, plastered over and sealed, a doorway, stamped into the plaster, still clear after 3 millennia, were the necropolis seals of the Valley of the Kings, the jackal god Anubis crouching over 9 bound captives, the symbol of protection over the royal dead. This confirmed it was a high-status burial, but as Carter leaned closer, his heart must have skipped a beat. Among the larger official seals, he could just make out the faint impression of a smaller, more personal one. It was the name he had been chasing for years, the ghost he had pursued against all logic, Tutankhamun. It was the moment of ultimate triumph. His theory was no longer a theory. He had found him. But that elation was immediately tempered by a cold dread. As his expert eyes scanned the surface of the doorway, he saw the telltale signs his heart sank to recognize. Near the top corner, a section of the plaster was clearly different. It was a patch. The doorway had been breached in antiquity, then resealed by the necropolis priests. It was the classic signature of tomb robbers. After all these years of searching for the one untouched tomb, had he merely found another empty shell, another scene of ancient desecration? The hope of a lifetime now hung in the balance. With painstaking care, Carter and his team removed the blocking stones of the first door. Behind it was not a treasure chamber, but a long, descending corridor, packed to the ceiling with limestone chippings and rubble. This was a good sign. It was a method the ancient priests used to deter any future thieves, but clearing it was back-breaking, monotonous work. For days, the team worked in the cramped, airless passage, hauling out basket after basket of rubble, and at the end of it, they found what they were looking for, a second sealed doorway, almost identical to the first. Carter approached it, hope battling with experience, and again, he saw the same heartbreaking signs. This door, too, had been breached and resealed. The disappointment was immense. His dream of finding a perfectly intact tomb was almost certainly dead. The best he could hope for now was to find whatever the ancient thieves had deemed not valuable enough to carry away. It was at this moment, standing before the final door to a potentially empty tomb, that Carter made the most difficult and professionally honorable decision of his life. He could not, and would not, open it alone. His contract and his ethics demanded that his patron, the man who had funded this long and often hopeless quest, be present. He ordered his workers to backfill the entire staircase and corridor to hide the discovery from the prying eyes and ever-present thieves of the valley. He placed guards at the site and sent a now legendary telegram to Lord Carnarvon, who was back in England. At last have made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact recovered. Same for your arrival, congratulations. He strategically omitted the detail about the resealed breaches. He needed his patron here, now, and without any doubt. Then came the agonizing wait. For more than 2 weeks, Carter lived on a knife's edge, guarding his secret, while Lord Carnarvon and his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, made the long journey by sea and rail from the green hills of England to the dusty Valley of the Kings. Finally, on the 26th of November, Etenjobai Asha'ar, the moment came. The staircase was cleared once more. Carter, with Carnarvon, Lady Evelyn, and his assistant Calendar at his side, stood before the second door. The silence in the small passage was absolute. Carter, his hands trembling slightly, took a sharp iron rod and chiseled a small hole in the top left corner of the door. Debris trickled through. He then lit a long candle and pushed it through the hole, testing for foul gases. The flame flickered wildly in the hot air rushing out from the sealed chamber. air that had not been disturbed for 200 years. But the flame did not go out. It was safe. He widened the hole. He took the candle again, held it up, and peered into the darkness, his eyes struggling to adjust from the bright Egyptian sun. For a long, silent moment, he was completely dumbfounded, struck speechless by the sight within. Behind him, Lord Carnarvon could not bear the suspense any longer. "Can you see anything?" he asked, his voice strained with anticipation. Carter struggled to find his voice. He moistened his lips and tried to respond, but the words would not come. Finally, he turned his head slowly, in a daze, and uttered the 5 words that would become immortal in the annals of archaeology. "Yes, wonderful things. Yes, wonderful things." With those 5 words, the world of Howard Carter, Lord Carnarvon, and all of Egyptology tilted on its axis. Carter widened the breach in the doorway, and one by one, the others peered in. They were met not by an aroma of decay, but by the faint, ethereal scent of ancient perfumes, resins, and dry wood. It was the smell of time itself. As their eyes adjusted to the flickering candlelight, the chaos slowly resolved into form. They were not looking into a tomb chamber, but a divine attic, a king's storeroom for eternity, packed to the ceiling with the glorious clutter of his life and death. Carter himself would later write, "At first I could see nothing, but presently, as my eyes grew accustomed to the light, details of the room within emerged slowly from the mist. Strange animals, statues, and gold. Everywhere the glint of gold. That single, overwhelming impression, the glint of gold, is what defined the discovery. The candlelight danced and reflected off hundreds of surfaces. Directly in front of them stood 3 colossal, otherworldly couches, their gilded wooden frames shining in the dark. One was carved in the shape of a lion, its face roaring silently into the gloom. A second took the form of a celestial cow, its serene face adorned with stars. The third was a terrifying composite beast, the hippo-crocodile monster, Amit, the devourer of souls. This was the furniture of the gods. Stacked against the walls in a beautiful, glittering pile was the king's celestial garage, a collection of golden chariots, disassembled for storage, their wheels, frames, and harnesses, all intricately carved and inlaid with colored glass and semi-precious stones, shone like newly minted treasure. These were the vehicles he would use to hunt for eternity, symbols of his pharaonic power and youthful vigor. But as their gaze penetrated deeper into the chamber, they saw something that stopped their hearts. Flanking another sealed doorway on the far wall, standing like sentinels, frozen in time, were 2 life-size statues of the king. Their bodies were carved from wood and coated in a stark, black resin, representing the fertile soil of the Nile and his rebirth. But their kilts, their sandals, their staffs, and their royal Nemes headdresses were all covered in brilliant gold leaf. Their eyes, inlaid with obsidian and alabaster, seemed to stare back at the intruders with a calm, unnerving authority. They were the guardians of the king's car, his spirit double, and they were guarding a secret. This room, this unbelievable treasure trove, was merely an antechamber. The real prize, the burial chamber itself, still lay beyond, protected by these 2 silent, golden guards. The room was filled with a dizzying array of other objects. There were elegant, translucent, alabaster vases, some of which, Carter would later find, still held the thick, perfumed unguents they had been filled with 200 years ago. There were intricately crafted chests and caskets of all sizes, their contents a complete mystery. There was a magnificent golden throne, a masterpiece of woodworking and artistry. There were boxes containing royal robes, sticks, and weapons, and scattered amongst this divine hoard were touchingly human objects, an exquisitely painted box for the game of Senet, the pharaoh's favorite pastime, a small, simple chair he likely used as a child, bouquets of flowers, now brittle and brown, left as a final tribute. This was the profound significance of the discovery. For the first time in modern history, archaeologists were seeing a royal tomb not as an empty potty, ransacked stone shell, but as it was intended to be, a complete, furnished home for the afterlife. The ancient robbers had clearly been here. Carter could see signs of their work, a few empty boxes, a general state of disarray, but they had been caught or disturbed. They had taken the most portable items, likely precious metals and oils, but the vast, heavy, and ultimately priceless majority of the collection remained. Before this moment, all knowledge of what a pharaonic burial looked like had been pieced together from fragments found in looted tombs and from two-dimensional paintings on tomb walls. It was like trying to understand a cathedral by looking at a single broken piece of stained glass. But here, suddenly, was the whole cathedral. It was a time capsule. Every object was a data point, a window into the life, art, technology, and faith of the 18th dynasty at its wealthiest peak. The sense of awe that must have washed over Carter, Carnarvon, and Lady Evelyn in that moment is almost impossible to comprehend. After years of chasing a ghost, of digging through sterile rock and sand, they had stumbled into a fairy tale. They were not just looking at gold, they were looking directly into the past, breathing the very air that had been sealed away since the Bronze Age. The discovery of the antechamber was not the end of the search, but the explosive beginning of a much larger story. The world still had no idea what lay sleeping in the Valley of the Kings, but the news was about to break, and the name of the forgotten boy king, Tutankhamun, was about to become the most famous name on the entire planet. For a few precious weeks, the discovery of Tomb KV62 was a secret known only to a handful of people on Earth. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated discovery, a private communion with the past. But a secret of this magnitude, like the air trapped inside the tomb, cannot be contained. It was destined to erupt into the world. The story of the century had been found, and the world was about to go mad for a forgotten Egyptian king. To manage the inevitable media storm, Lord Carnarvon made a calculated business decision. He sold the exclusive story rights to the Times of London for a significant sum. This move, intended to bring a semblance of order to the reporting and to help recoup his massive investment, had the opposite effect. It created a firestorm. The rest of the world's press, from Cairo to New York, was furious at being shut out. They descended upon the Valley of the Kings like a swarm of locusts, setting up a media siege at the entrance. They were hungry for any scrap of information, bribing workers, interviewing disgruntled officials, and writing sensationalized, often wildly inaccurate, stories. But it didn't matter. The core of the story was too incredible to be diminished. When the Times published its first official reports in late November and December 1922, the news exploded across the globe. In an age before television and the internet, the newspaper was king, and headlines screamed from every newsstand: King Tut's tomb found, Pharaoh's fabulous treasure, a romance of archaeology, a name that was utterly unknown just weeks before Tutankhamun was suddenly on the lips of millions. The public imagination, weary from the horrors of the First World War, seized upon this story of golden pharaohs and buried treasure. It was pure, romantic escapism, and it sparked a cultural phenomenon that became known as Tut Mania. Egypt was suddenly the height of fashion. The straight, drop-waist dresses of the 1,922nd flappers were suddenly adorned with lotus motifs and geometric patterns copied from the tomb's artifact. Jewelry designers created pieces inspired by scarab beetles, cobras, and the Eye of Horus. The dark, kohl-rimmed eyes of the pharaohs became a defining makeup trend. New Art Deco buildings, from cinemas to skyscrapers, incorporated Egyptian-style columns and symbols. Popular songs were written, like the hit Old King Tut. He was on advertisements for everything from sewing needles to oranges. The forgotten boy king had been resurrected as the world's first global media superstar. But while the world outside was lost in a frenzy of pop culture romance, the reality inside the tomb was one of slow, painstaking, and stressful scientific work. Carter was not a treasure hunter. He was an archaeologist, and he knew this was the single most important excavation in history. He was not there to grab gold, but to preserve knowledge. The sheer scale and fragility of the find were overwhelming. Realizing he could not do it alone, he made a crucial decision. He resealed the tomb's entrance and spent the next several weeks assembling an archaeological dream team. He recruited Arthur Mace, a brilliant conservator from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, to help with the delicate task of handling the fragile objects. He brought in Alfred Lucas, a government chemist, to be his forensics expert, tasked with finding ways to preserve 200-year-old wood, textiles, and floral bouquets that threatened to turn to dust upon contact with the air. He hired Harry Burton, the Met's finest photographer, to be the official record keeper. Burton's stunning, hauntingly beautiful black and white glass plate photographs would become the definitive visual record of the discovery, and he enlisted Sir Alan Gardiner, a leading philologist, to translate the many inscriptions they were sure to find. With his team assembled, the real work began in December 1922. The process of clearing just the antechamber would take 7 weeks of intense, nerve-wracking labor. It was the complete opposite of the romantic treasure hunt the public imagined. Every single one of the more than 700 objects in that first room had to be treated with the utmost care. First, Burton would photograph the object exactly as it was found. Then, its position would be meticulously measured and recorded on a floor plan. Carter would write a detailed description on a note card for each item. Then, Mace and Lucas would perform on the spot conservation, sometimes dripping hot paraffin wax onto a decaying piece of gilded wood to stabilize it, or spraying a celluloid solution onto a beaded garment to keep it from falling apart. Only then could the object be carefully moved, often on a custom-made stretcher, to their makeshift laboratory in the nearby empty tomb of Seti II for further treatment. All of this was done under incredible pressure. The media siege continued unabated. A constant stream of tourists, dignitaries, and royalty descended on the valley, all demanding personal tours from the increasingly short-tempered Carter, and a new, more serious pressure was building. Egypt, having recently gained nominal independence from Britain, was in the grip of a powerful nationalist movement. Egyptians began to rightfully and loudly ask, why is this English lord and his English archaeologist in sole charge of our nation's greatest cultural treasure? The political tensions between Carter's team and the Egyptian Antiquities Service began to simmer, a conflict that would later boil over and threaten to shut down the entire excavation. Carter found himself juggling a global media circus, a tourist crush, a brewing political storm, and the most delicate and scientifically important archaeological task ever undertaken. The entire world was watching, waiting for him to get to the main event, the prize that everyone was anticipating, the sealed doorway, flanked by the 2 silent, black and gold guardians. By February of 1923, after weeks of painstaking work, the antechamber was finally clear. The stage was now set to answer the question on everyone's mind: what and who lay in the chamber of gold?